got 115 people who've joined. The meeting's also being live streamed. I hope that you're okay with the recording our guests and everyone else who's here. My name is Farhana Yamin. I am the coordinator of this initiative called the Climate Justice, Just Transition Donor Collaborative Project. A bit of a mouthful. I used to always pride myself on having really nice, neat acronyms for all the projects that I worked on. But I think this time it was really important for us to maintain the integrity of these two terms, climate justice and just transition. Both of them have an amazing history, an amazing set of champions, an amazing rationale, an amazing set of actions and campaigns that are going on, and an amazing transformative potential. And as a climate lawyer who's been very active in the negotiations of the climate treaties, it was really a pleasure to see that both those terms are referenced separately in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. And one of the reasons why this project came into gestation was really that not enough had been done since that big achievement. I know getting even a tiny line, a paragraph into something as heavily negotiated and agreed on by state parties as the Paris Agreement was, took the best part of 5 years actually. So getting that those preambular paragraphs was very important. And now we felt that it was time to push forward on what they meant and to integrate and center these concepts in all of climate policy, not just internationally, but also the work of all of the actors who are in it. So I was approached this time in February, actually, of 2021 by Heather McGray, who is the Executive Director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, the CJRF, which is based in the US, and which was then at that time one of the only funders that was supporting more intersectional, more global South based, more those who are on the front line and who are asking for more radical solutions. So I was approached with a view to organizing an initiative that would engage philanthropy, would educate philanthropy, would try and make sure that the kinds of issues, the kinds of linkages, the kinds of perspectives, the new, more radical ways of thinking, the more transformative and joined up ways of thinking that were being put forward by the Global South, by those on the front line, by Black and brown people who had been marginalized in philanthropy as they have been in mainstream, in the mainstream, were put to the fore. So we've agreed with 6 different foundations to take forward a learning journey for philanthropy, informed by those who are experts in and led by those doing the best intersectional work and those who are on the front line. So this is, I think, our 5th webinar. And from these webinars, we are going to try and harvest insights and learnings and inform as the project comes to its close in the next 6 months or so, what philanthropy needs to do. Obviously, philanthropy is doing a lot, but the truth is that by and large, most of climate philanthropy, which is a very small part of the overall philanthropic pie, most of that philanthropy has gone to organizations led by men, and most of that philanthropy has gone to organizations led by white people. And therefore, the Global South has been massively underserved. That is where all the bulk of the population of the world lives. It's where the frontline communities are based, and it's also where most action needs to happen. So we're trying through our small initiative to make sure that the next stage, the next rounds of philanthropy, both pivot towards supporting those on the front lines more, especially those in the Global South, and that the overall pie increases, but increases in a way that over the longer term shifts power and resources to those on the front line. So that's our sort of mission, that we don't want to just engage in the pots of money and let's increase it a bit. We want that money to really be transformative, and that means changing the practices of philanthropy itself, changing the mindsets of philanthropy itself, of who is recognized as a leader who has solutions, who has agency, who has capacity. So let me they know more about where this project came from. There's an effort now for us to try and create a website. There is information on my own personal website, which was an interim holding space for where the project has come from. We're going to put in the chat a flyer for those of you who want to learn more and be engaged in more of these webinars that we will be having in the next few months. And then we are also in the process of now having for open review a landscape and mapping of those who are active in the climate justice and just transition spaces. Currently a database, quite nerdy. If you like your Excel sheets, you'll love this. But it's sort of around 800 organizations and campaigns, and we want to try and transform the way in which philanthropy works, which is often someone has a great idea and says, I have a pot of money, and then they hire a consultant to go out and look for people. And we want a mapping which is going to be open and transparent and be as useful for the field as it is for philanthropy. So that's the idea behind that. And again, we'll put a little bit of information about that. It's currently going to be open for review, and then we hope to put it out in the public domain and hopefully have a way to update and maintain it. It's called the compendium. I love the word compendium. So it's called the compendium, and we'll be asking you and through your networks to kindly review it and to give your advice, suggestions, updates as much as possible. So let me now introduce to you Derek Bardwell, who is a writer who is worked in philanthropy. He's currently the CEO of 10 Years Time, which is an organization I came to know and learned a lot from. And he is going to be the moderator for this session. His bio is in the chat as well, so we're hoping to save a bit of time by making sure that everyone's bios are put in the chat. He's a fellow at the Scholes Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. He's written an amazing book called No Win Race, which I have a copy of, which was a really important book. And I think he's one of the key people who in philanthropy is really pushing the boundaries of what we think philanthropy should think of itself and be about, not just in the climate space, but overall. So over to you, Derek, to host and moderate this session. And a huge thank you for pulling together such an amazing set of people. I'm so proud that you have been part of this effort and have done that. And I know that 10 Years Time is doing amazing work as well. So over to you, and maybe we'll put in the chat function the report that 10 Years Time did on racial justice, which came out a few months ago. So thank you so much, and thank you to all of the presenters as well. As I said, this is being recorded. Please provide any resources, materials, comments, questions in the chat function. One of the key and very nice features of our webinars has been this very rich exchange between people in and through the chat function. And one of our aims is to try and bridge and bring closer philanthropy to those who are, as I said, on the front line and who are working and part of this climate justice and just transition space. So thank you very much, and thank you hugely also to all of the audience for participating. And over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Farhana, and just to say, thank you for inviting us here. And also, I'm really excited because of having Stephanie, Ali, Jenny, and Mara to share this space with me, which is amazing. As Farhana said, my name's Derek Bardwell. I'm the CEO of 10 Years Time, and we're philanthropy advisors and educators that guide funders through learning experience to dismantle systems of harm and to resource racial and economic justice with care and confidence. With us today, we have Stephanie Brobby, who is the CEO and founder of the Good Ancestors movement, and you'll hear more about her and her work through the course of this webinar today. We have Jenny Oppenheimer, who is the co-founder of Future Foundations UK. We have Ali Tarabi, who is the program manager for rights and justice at the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. And we also have Mara Larasai, who is the co-founder of Project Talawa. So welcome to the guests. Before I hand over to first Stephanie, I just want to, talk a little bit about why we're here today. So at 10 years time, we guide, philanthropists, corporate foundations, high net worth individuals, charitable trusts through process of honest reflection and radical action. And we want those funders, those people with wealth, to redistribute resources and rebalance power, but to do it through a reparative lens. And the reason why the reparative lens is so relevant to the conversation that we're having today is because of that notion of where this money and these resources should really start to go to and how that should change. We exist in an economy where wealth and power and access has been decided on racial lines. When we look at the Industrial Revolution, Europe's infrastructure that grew from this was heavily reliant on the extraction and exploitation of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. We know that the underdevelopment of the geopolitical South was an intentional consequence of Europe's quest for supremacy across the globe. And even at the point when slavery ended, for example, in the UK, when slavery was abolished, the British government handed out 20 million to the enslavers, which is the equivalent of 2.4 billion pounds today, to those that enslaved people. That was the biggest bailout until the 2008 financial crisis. But the problem exists today, and the problem still exists today. Wealth continues to be drained from formerly colonized peoples in the form of land grabs, ultra low wages, national debt, and other means of extraction. Since 1960, the geopolitical North has plundered over $160 trillion from the geopolitical South. And that includes $2.2 trillion per year. And the geopolitical North is also responsible for over 90% of the excess carbon emissions. What we see today in terms of philanthropy is an institution that, while doing some good, has become a bit like the stepchild of capitalism. The good cop to the private market's bad cop. And we see this, and I don't want to get too statistical, but I'm going to just break it down statistically. So we know in the UK that only 5% of racially minoritized-led organizations get funding from charitable trusts in this country, even though we comprise 14% of the population. Between 0.1 and 0.35% of money globally goes to Black feminist movements. 90% of environmental funding goes to white-led organizations. 80% goes to organizations led by men. Only 0.2% focuses on women and the environment. This culture of extraction, which we see in philanthropy, shows up in how wealth has been accumulated, how it is invested, who makes the decisions, who receives the money, and a sector that bows to the confidence of those wearing suits at the expense of trusting those who experience the atrocities. I want people that are in the room today to really acknowledge this. And I want you to acknowledge that when we, as panelists, people of color, share our truths and our expertise, often to many people that might fear that and might not understand it, and some that will not necessarily empathize with it, that this can be for us a very violent space. And in sharing a lot of this stuff, I had someone very recently said to me when I did a talk and I was speaking the way that I was speaking, said, oh, there was lots of people that were very fearful of the things you were saying. And I said, fearful? Do you realize that the majority of people who are all funders have way more power than I do? So what do they have to fear, given that it's probably still going to be me asking them for money to be able to fulfill my work? They can walk away. I cannot walk away. So I want everyone to enter this space with empathy for our truths. But while many of the things that we might say might make you feel uncomfortable and challenge your own truth, we invite you to sit with that. We want you to stay present with the topic, but present with us. We enter this space with kindness in our hearts, progression in our spirits, and hope always. Think about questions, not declarations. And for a moment, abandon your frameworks. Be comfortable being out of the frame and not jump into conclusions. So you can really hear what we're saying. And I also ask you guys to ask yourselves, what will you learn about yourself in this space? What can you do with the power that you have? And what difference can you make? And what will you commit to doing differently once you leave this space? In the beginning part of this talk, we are going to take you on a brief journey. And the brief journey will start with where we are today, how things stand at the moment. But we're also going to take you to a vision of the future and start to speak a bit later when we do the Q&A into the steps that can help you get there. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Stephanie Brobby to start. And Stephanie, when you're finished, if you could then pass the baton, that would be fantastic.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Always a gift to share space with you, and delighted to be here this afternoon. So my organisation, the Good Ancestor Movement, supports individuals and organisations with regenerative and reparative wealth stewardship. So the perspective that I bring is very much focused on the role of philanthropic institutions and individuals and the overriding function that their capital serves, and how this needs to change. So to understand the specific context of the need to address racial justice as philanthropic investors and the broader mandate to decolonise the institution of philanthropy, we need to interrogate our systems of economy and governance over the last century, and to understand where philanthropic capital is positioned in the broader economic order, how it got there, and what it's doing now. Philanthropic capital doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's been generated by an economic system which is rooted in extraction and exploitation to serve the continued accumulation of wealth. Beyond its initial creation, the extractivism which characterises our dominant economic system is reflected in philanthropic activity, which for the most part prioritises making financial returns at all costs to continue grant making over the advancement of social and ecological well-being as the primary purpose of the wealth that is entrusted to them as organisations which purport to exist for the public benefit. And while many foundations will have directly benefited from the systems of oppression constructed by slavery, genocide, and other colonial activity in the past, and there's been more discussion about this over the last couple of years in particular, what's not explicitly addressed is the philanthropic world's continued role in propping up oppressive financial systems which facilitate an ongoing wealth transfer from the global south to the global north by extractive means, on top of the centuries of extraction and exploitation inflicted on economies in the global north. In the global south. So let me put this into context. The asset manager BlackRock manages over £25 billion for charities and endowments worldwide. And that includes around 6 billion in the UK for over 3,000 clients. Some of you will have heard about an ongoing campaign against BlackRock, which holds $220 million worth of Zambian's sovereign bonds and stands to generate $180 million for its clients if those debts are paid in full. So Zambia has incurred crippling debt in order to try and build its infrastructure and to protect its people from the climate emergency specifically. BlackRock and other corporate lenders have refused to suspend interest payments despite the financial difficulties that Zambia is facing. And this is a classic example of how debt is preventing lower income global majority countries from protecting themselves against the worst effects of climate change, all the while enriching investors in the global north. Financial markets are racialized by design. And this is clear evidence of a financial system and broader economic system that rewards harm inflicted on global majority communities, and a specific example of why propping up these systems is not only counter to climate justice, but is actually causing more inequity insofar as sharing the burden of climate change is concerned, and correcting past injustices having regards to the relationship between Western imperialism and climate change. So the philanthropic community has to look at how, not if, it is being complicit with the social and environmental harm being caused specifically against global majority communities through financial markets. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm not entirely sure who I'm passing over to, but Derek, perhaps you can
pass it over to Jenny.
Over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Stephanie. So my part in this is, if we're doing a webinar on racial justice, we need to talk about that. And also a lot of the funders on the call, we sit within a European context, to just contextualize that a bit. So when we talk about racial justice, I think we have to really understand racial injustice, and, to feel that in our belly, and to, when we see that certain shades of people live in particular areas, and that certain people who are experiencing the excesses of war are treated differently depending on where they come from. And when you realize that wealth is accumulated and concentrated in the global north, but when we had a global pandemic, life-saving medicines were hoarded by the rich nations. We need to recognize that racial justice is social justice work, and that to do it well, we have to be deliberate about considering all the historic as well as current inequities that are experienced by individual racial groups. We also have to center those that have been and continue to be harmed by those injustices. And we need to know that the work has to center on building the civic, cultural, and political power of those impacted. When we talk about it in the European context, the picture is quite complex. And that's partly because the idea of equality is so deeply embedded in the European psyche and in its strategies and its institutional functioning. And that framing can trap nations and get in the way of getting to grips with the ideas of what equity and justice means, and that how that plays out for people experiencing racism. And I know that this is a generalization, but when speaking to Europeans, a common reaction to talking about racial justice is to intellectualize it, rather than getting to the systems critique that we need to. And I believe some of the reasons for that could be that racism in Europe is often seen as something that's individual or a personal response, rather than something that exists at an institutional or systemic level. And that can manifest as an out there attitude to racial justice work. So I've often heard, well, racial justice is a US import, isn't it? And structural racism doesn't exist in Europe because everyone here is equal, aren't they? And also, nations are not necessarily examining their colonial histories. So that leaves little space for debate about the systemic causes of injustice. And instead, it focuses on problematizing issues such as religion or nationality. And another complication is that few European languages have a direct translation for racial justice. And that builds into that tendency to, think about the semantics of it. It's obviously much more complex than those few points I've made, and there are national idiosyncrasies. But what's important to remember is that those structural injustices and systemic issues extend beyond individual borders, and that philanthropy, with its concentration of power, wealth, and status, perhaps uncomfortably for all of us on the call, in many ways reflect modern day versions of colonial practices and structures and values. I'll stop there for now, and I'll pass to Ali.
Hello, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Stephanie, for laying out so many things that I was going to talk about, but much better than I am. I wanted to start a bit differently in terms of give you where I was born, why that matters, give you where I am now, why that matters. I was born not far from a place where oil was first found in Middle East by Reuters concession, late empire, and then when Reuters couldn't actually find it, Lord Curzon future Viceroy of India. That is my hometowns, that is the region that I grew up, the last big extractions of the empires of Europe. And the history of that goes through in Iran history and sort of in Middle East history and more globally. But I also wanted to acknowledge sort of where I am now and come to it a bit indirectly, which is these conversations have increased about race, about environment, about the intersections of them. And they have increased because of something that has happened, maybe not in where we are. We haven't noticed it where we are. We have looked at the American empire and noticed the uprising that happened after the murder of George Floyd and the continued uprisings that have happened beforehand. So I wanted to bring you back to where I am now and pay homage to somebody who was murdered in the same way in Brixton Police Station in London, Sean Riggs, and the campaigns that are trying to defend lives that are being brutalized, either directly by state violence or indirectly by climate change and the global economic order. That's one side of it. I also wanted to say a little bit about how, personally and institutionally, we find ourselves complicit in this order. We didn't design it individually, but we benefit from it. And I wanted you to think about the board members, the senior staff, the largest grantees, and think about what they have in common, not only in terms of melanin and skin color, but class and assets and where they grew up and what they had access to. And then think about who cleans the office after we all go home and who works on the products that clean that office. So I think, let's have that bigger image of what is the debate that is happening internationally, but let's bring it back home to where we are. And I wanted to end it with what Stephanie was so eloquently explaining, that the capital that philanthropy sits on is doing racial injustice every minute of every day, because it is out there working to resource all of the tools of the global economy. Now, there may be certain investments that are doing that less so. We may be consciously moving out of some spaces, but we also have to make a decision in all of the other things that we are doing, how we want to counteract that work of the capital. So we can't distinguish between the environmental justice and the racial justice, between the gender justice and the environmental justice, between the borders that we have set up and bordering that we are doing on a day-to-day basis and the environmental justice that needs to happen. I'll end it there and I pass it to Marai.
Ancestral and warrior greetings, everyone. It really is a blessing to be here in this important conversation. I'm at that stage in life where the memory fails, so I have to look at my notes, so please bear with me if you see me looking down quite a lot. So I can only be in this space with you today because of my beloved community, my Black feminist collective, Project Taloa. So I come here as a we rather than as a me, rather than an I. And I also, Ali, thank you for mentioning Sean Rigg. And so I also want to invoke the memory of Sarah Reid, because again, so often we actually can think about who has been killed on US soil without knowing who has been harmed and killed here on these islands and what that means for Black women, for Black women's bodies. In Project Taloa, we take an intersectional and emancipatory approach to our work. So this allows us to enter philanthropy, for what it's worth, via ancestral memory, dreaming and disruption. That really is the work that we do. So we're called in to center disability justice. We're called in to center LGBTQI liberation. We're called in to center the love that we have for the planet. And really this space of like, how do we heal? How do we heal the planet? You know, if we think that we've got 8 years before she actually just might shake us off, right? Like, what do we need to do in terms of our work. So we start with a few key points. And Jenny, thank you for mentioning our bellies, because the ongoing impact of colonization is felt so deeply in our bodies, in our bellies. We come from a place of the dominant economic models are corrupt and violent. We will not define those models as broken, as they were never intended to free us. And they continue to be held in place by a limited but powerful group of humans for the benefit of a limited number of wealthy, financially rich people. We cannot heal the planet and we cannot free ourselves if we continue to center the most powerful human beings. And for us, we cannot do this without taking an intersectional approach, which for us means rooting that in Black feminist organizing. And that Black feminist organizing, we know, has necessarily involved everything from the delivery of support services to strategic advocacy and policy work to direct action such as demonstrations and public protests. Movement building takes place through community arts projects, through conscientization work, and through building social justice theory, and it is often untidy. And I want to invite us to be in the untidiness of what liberation practice is. To do intersectional work is to enter the messy space that most of us have to live in. Like, if you happen to be a Black woman, then you understand what it is to live, especially if you don't have immediate access to wealth, if you don't have a particular kind of status, you know what it is to live in the messiness of life. If you happen to be a Black woman living on these islands, then you are, so if you happen to be disabled, if you happen to be queer, then you are you have skin in the game, yo. You are routinely subjected to the messiness of life. And so I invite us to sit with that and hold that as we think about, like, how do we not just reimagine philanthropy, right? But how do we actually upend it? How do we take it and turn it on its head so that it is no longer in service from this place of benevolence? It's no longer in service to holding the power systems in place, but philanthropy actually tunes into its original place of actually like friendship and love, right? How do we move into this space of actually having philanthropy being service to liberation, and in liberation to the folk, those human beings that are the most marginalized human beings on our planet? Fahana already mentioned what it means in terms of like global inequity. Like who do we know who are being killed? Like who's being harmed by ecological disaster? Who do we know? When we look at COVID-19, we have such powerful evidence of the kind of inequity that I'm talking about. So my invitation is always, like, let's take an intersectional approach to any of this work. At Project Hala, we position ourselves inside movement building. We relate to ourselves as organizers, disruptors, radical dreamers. We've got skin in the game. And as Maury Elder Lila Watson wisely offered, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. If we are to heal the planet, this is going to need all of us, but we do need to think about who we center in the conversation. Black women are often the miner's canary. Black disabled women in particular, Black queer women are often the miner's canary. There's work that we need to do to make sure that we shift our axis and that we shift our focus. Thank you.
Mara, thank you. Before I now move towards the vision for the future, I want to just say a quote, and this quote came from the author Carol Boyce Davies, who was the biographer of Claudia Jones. And Claudia Jones was a political activist, feminist and Black nationalist, and I would urge anyone that is on this call today to read more about Claudia Jones. But Boyce Davies wrote this about Jones. She said, "Jones clearly felt that Caribbean traditions had much to offer the world in terms of creating a culture of human happiness over the ignorance and pains of racism. And indeed, it was the people's culture that provided them with the basis for acquiring their freedom." And I just want to come back to a couple of points there. The people's culture. The people's culture. One of the things that we saw over the last 2 years is some funders making some bold moves to be able to forefront people's culture. We saw that with the creation of the Resourcing Racial Justice Fund, which was led by Black and Brown activists, artists, dreamers, and amazing people. We saw that with the way that the Ubele initiative mobilized a number of organizations across the UK in partnership to create the Phoenix Way Partnership. We've seen that traditionally with the Edge Fund and the way that they have supported organizations that were unconstituted, but a number of organizations like Sisters Uncut, like Black Lives Matter UK, like Ubele, who are at the forefront of the protests and social change across the UK over the last 2 years. And we are seeing some funders being very, very bold in terms of how they are not divorcing investments from grant making, their money from their mission, like the 30 Percy Foundation, as an example. So there are some examples of change, not enough, and it's not as widespread as it should be, but there is a roadmap to some of that change. But I want to come back to it. Some of the key points of why these things happen was because power was ceded and because people's culture was forefronted in those particular movements. I'm now going to come to Stephanie Brobby to speak about the future.
Thank you, Derek. So I think one of the most urgent questions we should be asking ourselves is, how do we need to reimagine and redesign our economy, including wealth that's held by philanthropic institutions and private wealth, such that we are able to liberate capital in ways that are democratic, participatory, and regenerative for the benefit of global majority communities? And how do we apply capital towards financial restoration and reparations after present and historic dispossession and extraction? Specifically in the context of the climate emergency, how do we use capital to enable those communities to build their own climate resilience? And much of the work that we undertake at the Good Ancestor Movement is underpinned by the strategy framework for a just transition, which was developed by the Climate Justice Alliance and Movement Generation. And under this framework, the idea of a just transition is the process of getting from where we are now to where we need to be as a global community by transforming our systems of economy and governance. So it's about recognizing that our economy, as it is now, does need to transition because it's not going to be capable of sustaining itself in its current form without significant ecological collapse and economic upheaval. And so the vision is really to shift from this globalized, extractive industrial economy, which is supported by growth narratives and the need to maximize financial returns, to a more regenerative economy that is participatory, that serves ecological and social well-being and advances social equity and racial justice. In order for that to happen, we need to center ecological and social well-being as the purpose of the economy instead of the continued accumulation of wealth and power, which is concentrated among certain institutions and individuals. So some of the key strategies which emerge from this are kind of calls for a need to redefine the mission and purpose of the resources entrusted to philanthropic funders. And broadly speaking, the role of capital in the just transition is to build the collective capacity of communities that have been harmed by the extractive economy, and that's global majority communities predominantly, and to transfer the power from institutions to communities who are developing their own solutions in response to the multiple ecological and social crises that we're facing. The role of philanthropy within that strategy is to actively build new economic systems that transfer the management and control of financial resources away from institutions and towards communities that have been impacted by wealth accumulation and the extractive economy. And this is all about giving the communities that are most impacted by the current economic system, self-determination and sovereignty, so that they're able to govern their resources effectively and directly benefit from them, unlike the current system where a lot of control and power remains at the institutional level. This is about building the collective capacity of communities that have been harmed by the extractive economy and transferring power to them. So whether that's an organisation like Amazon Frontlines, who are working side by side in Ecuador, in indigenous communities to build access to renewable energy and rainwater harvesting systems, investing in regenerative agriculture businesses in Zambia, whether it's funding activists who are defending their rights to land and to clean water, the strategy is always to shift power and resources back to communities that have been harmed. So I'll stop there and pass over to Jenny.
Thanks, Stephanie. So if we're talking about decolonizing philanthropy, which is what this series is about, we can't just be talking about what's happening out there. We have to be talking about what's happening with us and within our institutions. And again, to reinforce what Stephanie is saying, you know, how we are aligning our behaviors, our structures, our practices and actions with the mission. And I am going to talk a bit about the journey that the institution I work for, Lankelly Chase Foundation, and what it's been on. And to do that, I'm just going to paint you a picture. So when I joined 4.5 years ago, its focus was on systems change. And when it came to work on race, to be frank, it had a really neo-colonial mindset. You know, it reproduced all the colonial dynamics of extraction and exploitation. And it was sometimes couched in activities which we described as bringing people in or giving them voice. And we had quite an intellectualized view of systems change. And what that did was it just re-marginalize folks and deprioritize communities of color. And plus the language we use maintained those divisions. We also had a very Eurocentric view. And we love the ideas and models. And, you know, for instance, Lankelly Chase would say, we're spreading or democratizing systems change tools to marginalized communities. And the practices and funding relationships tended to problematize race. But we are a very different organization now. We're not there yet, but we've committed to a journey, and we are talking about a vision of a world of justice and liberation for all. So how did we get there? What are some of the successes to shout about? We did the internal work to challenge the colonial mindsets and to reveal the structures that feed oppressive systems. And that is helping us now to disrupt some of those dominant white-centered mindsets and revealing that racism, othering, and exclusion had become normalized in the organization. We changed our governance, and we now have trustees who are aligned with the issues with direct connections to communities. And spoiler alert, Marai is one of our trustees. And we are acting on how and where the money is invested. We're connecting the endowment to racial justice. We're looking at ways to make the money work for racialized communities that goes beyond the simple transactional grant making. And we are shifting economic control to communities. But it was a hard journey to get there, and we made mistakes, and I want to share some of them. We intellectualized the problem, and we lost years debating. I had a colleague early on say to me, how does the historical systems of colonialism relate to current work? And that is coming from someone born in a place whose empire at its height covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. Basically, we didn't understand racial injustice. And that intellectualizing gave us a get out of jail free card. We talked a lot, but we didn't do much. And we were also a smart bunch. So we picked up the lingo, you know, power, privilege, redistribution, trauma, all of that. We use it like a spray gun sometimes, and also a smoke screen. And importantly, we abdicated responsibility. We asked communities to do the risky work. And that was a mega power play because it asked racially traumatized people to do the exposing racial justice work while we sat in security on the sidelines learning. And we're still centering ourselves. We're talking about us rather than us as part of an ecosystem. And during that process, what was my role in the philanthropic space? It was about owning my positional and individual power and becoming a disruptor and an accountability node. For instance, bringing in new and different partnerships, circling back on commitments, not kowtowing to hostility, and not sharing vicarious or transactional trauma in order to be heard, but finding allies, facilitating and challenging the organization's thinking. It's also been about building social and collective power outside of the organization in the formation of places like future foundations, and actually sitting on the board of some philanthropic or philanthropy related networks. That gave me credibility for the messages to be heard. And the vision I would leave you with is, I think it's an American comedian who said it, whatever the problem, be part of the solution. Don't sit around raising questions and pointing out the obstacles. We, all of us, have power to influence change. We just need to step into it, and who knows what a beautiful new thing we'll create. I will now pass to Ali.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Making it harder each round to follow up. I'm just saying it for all of the speakers. Just like it's not easy. What I wanted to talk to you about was sort of the journey that the organization that I work for, the first philanthropic organization I have ever worked for. I come from sort of the trade union movement outside of these spaces and have been in philanthropy for a year and a bit, still finding it odd, still asking questions that are quite simple. And I think in terms of, if you are in the UK, you have probably heard of the statement that sort of different Rowntree origined foundations and trusts made last year about the sources of the money, about where sort of Joseph Rowntree, just for those who don't know, was a confectionery maker, chocolate business in late sort of British Empire, coinciding not that sort of distantly with sort of time-wise with Curzon and all of the other people that I mentioned. So we are talking that time of history. And it started with some people internally, including our chief exec, asking a very simple question of, have we done any research about the links of this institution that is of 19th century to slave trade and slavery? And that opened up a whole set of answers that we weren't internally prepared for, and questions, again, that were internally raised. But I think that the moment that all of the dynamics shifted is the moment that we were open with the 300 odd grantees about this, about the fact that this money is not our money, that this money comes on the back of partially slave labor, cocoa farmers. It is not just because UK stepped out of the slave trade that the rest of the world did. In the same way, it was Portuguese colonies at some point, it was different colonies, and sort of, global nature of trade has been around with us for a long time. And I think the other thing that I would say that changed the dynamics internally and externally about how we do this work was persuading ourselves, both as staff and trustees, to be open with people about this and to have a conversation about what does this mean. And that led to, I think overall it was 6 town halls, 140 odd people coming and asking us questions about, what does this mean about your direction? What does it mean about where you're going? What does it mean about what you fund? And I think all of those stuff is now slowly changing the natures of how we see issues. Joseph Rowntree told us in his memorandum to focus on root causes of issues. but we have turned these root causes into issue silos. And I think that's something that chimes with probably with social sort of environmental justice funders, that a lot of times you look at environment, but you don't look at trade. You look at environment and you don't look at gender. You look at environment and you don't look at disability. And I think we want to sort of moving forwards. I want to personally, I can't talk for the rest of the organization. We are still in that space of figuring out. We are still in that messy space that Jenny was talking about. We want to move towards a space that recognizes these things that we are talking are not only social problems, but they're also political problems. They are political problems that have been handed over by generations of political decisions and political inaction to us. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it, I wanted to like sort of, you know, thank you, Farhana and co, for like creating that list of organizations. I don't know whether it's sort of the organization I'm going to mention is in there, but for me, how we are going to move forward is to look at organizations that work across the intersections and across borders. And that is going to be harder because a lot of times we find it simpler to fund what is familiar, what is close, what we can look and what we can understand. And I think we need to go beyond that. So I will share sort of, you know, the committee's decision to fund systemic justice, an organization that is working across welfare, environmental justice, prisons, migration in Europe, and sort of enabling communities to own litigation, to own the tools of law. And I'm going to share a little blog that they had about reflections of different organizations that they brought together that are doing environmental justice work. There will be two sort of blogs that I will share in, and yeah, that's where I would end it.
All right.
Thanks, Derek. I guess I want to just take a moment to acknowledge Jenny. Sorry, Jenny, you did the face. But it's important. I want to take that moment, like Jenny and Derek and other people, like, you know, who have been in this work for so long and who have been holding the line and pushing through and showing up and holding exhaustion and living all of that in your bodies. I want to acknowledge you for like just holding space for us and continuing to hold space for us, because it's really important. And that has taken something. So thank you for that work, and for all the melanated folk who are out there doing that labor on a day-to-day basis and who keep holding space for us. Thank you for what you're doing. So I come at this kind of as new kid on the block, like with, you know, I identify as a Black feminist troublemaker and time traveler. And so we, you know, part of the Project Talawa collective space is really about actually disruption. So for us, the key thing is, how do we embody the emancipation that we are saying is so important to us? Like, what does it look like? And Stephanie started off with this conversation about, like, what are we practicing? So how do we move the thing, you know, like Jenny spoke about this, how do we move the thing from the intellectual, and I'm not devaluing intellect, by the way, it has its place, but how do we move from like just being up here to like what we practice in the ways that we work? So in Project Talawa, like the first thing for us was like, we need to disrupt the charity model, because the charity model is this Victorian benevolent thing that is not invested in changing anything. It's actually invested in keeping business as usual, keeping the system going. And again, I really invite any funders in the space to think about whether this could be part of your movement building work, to actually start to think about how do we dismantle those structures, because those structures hold us in place. Project Talawa really emerged very quietly, very much under the radar. We have been intentional and deliberate about keeping very quiet. Like Derek and Jenny and a couple of other people knew that we were there, like a bunch of witches kind of stirring our cauldron, kind of going, what does the world look like? But for us, this means like meaningful practice, taking it slow. It means recognizing the urgency of the meta crisis we are facing, while at the same time not engaging with everything with that kind of capitalist urgency, need to fix and sort everything out in this moment. It has meant being in deep relationship with our many communities, which or Black and global majority feminists, activists, creatives, dreamers, community folk who may not define their work as feminists or activists, disruptors working within philanthropy, Black, global majority, Indigenous, disabled, queer, survivor, academics, students, like our community on these islands and our communities that are located in different places. We have been really open about our interdependence. For us, it's really fascinating that when people know each other and they have been to Eton, that it's fine. But when Black folk know each other and they're doing liberation work and they happen to know each other, and then that becomes problematized in terms of how we are understood in the different spaces. And so for us, we are like, Black feminist technology means that we know each other. We're in deep community with each other. We have been deliberate in constructing an organizational structure that is horizontal, so it's much more of a spiral. Like, we don't have an executive, and we're deliberate in not having an executive because we really want to be like, and I say living lab carefully because many of us have, you know, the legacies of experimentation, but I say living lab as in we want to be like, how do we practice the thing that we want to see? So what does it look like to be, okay, the system tells us it needs to look like that, but what if it doesn't look like that? What if it looks like we have deep accountability, that we take time with each other, that we practice revolutionary love in how we communicate, that we have a working agreement that we collectively designed instead of a set of organization and policies that come up from on high. So for us, that's what our liberation practice looks like. It literally means, how do we do this in ways that are very different from how we are taught good looks? Because for us, if we're going to disrupt capitalism, it's like Audre Lorde said, the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. It doesn't mean that sometimes we don't have to be strategically pragmatic, because we all do. We are all, as you know, an amazing author said, we're all in the process of hospicing modernity right now. But while we're doing that, for us, we want to move as far as we can outside of business as usual. We're not just a group of Black women doing business as usual. It's not an injection of melanin, and yet the structures remain the same. We are turning this on its head. But again, people can ask questions, so I'm going to stop right there.
Mara, hi, thank you. And I'm aware that there's quite a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask the panelists just a couple of questions instead of all of the questions that I had lined up. And the first one, I'm going to open this one out to everyone, actually. And it's around the need for honest reflection and the need for action. So to any of the panelists, and you can take either one or both, in terms of honest reflection for those wealth holders, what does that look like for you? And in terms of action, in supporting racially minoritized-led organizations, ideas, institutions, innovators, what does that look like to you? Who would like to take that? Before I pick.
Derek, I can start us off really quickly. Reflective questions: where does your money come from? What are you doing with it right now? Where are you spending it? Like, who's been harmed in the ways that you spend it? Who's been harmed in the ways that you invest it? And when I say whom, I'm treating the planet as her own ecosystem. So I'm including her, right? So like, what damage are we doing? And actually, what could you do to heal? Like, what work do you need to do to heal the harm that you have been a part of?
Thank you. Others? A hard one to follow, Mara. Okay, I'm going to come to another question because I do want to get to the Q&A quite quickly. Ali, I want to ask a question about the realities for a foundation, and what do you think, and actually this is for you as well, Jenny, what do you think are some of the key ingredients, particularly around honest reflection, that should lead to change, or a starting point to begin that journey to change?
Jenny?
First, okay, I can take a punt at that. I think it builds on Marai's questions just now, and it leads to questions about what are you willing to give up, and to get to that answer, there has to be a bit of work, a significant amount of work that happens by the people holding the power. And I think in our organization, when I saw that happen, was when senior white colleagues went through that deep internal analysis and reflection. And when they got it here and here, that if their position and their perspective was part of the problem. And actually, it wasn't that anything to do with the fact that they were good people or not. So that kind of internal journey, that recognition that my very perspective is getting in the way, is a first start.
So I think that's an important point, and I think that's sort of like reflecting on it. There is, if an organization, and I'm making a great assumption here, but a lot of organizations in this space are existing within a white supremacist structure that has never questioned itself. If an organization is starting to go on this journey, I would ask two questions. Are you doing it in the same way that a lot of our institutions responded to murder of George Floyd, to get social kudos? Like, are you doing it as an act of signaling? Because that will not get you very far. That is a good starting point to say something, but I think the deeper work needs to happen afterwards. I would also say another thing that is sort of, this is about, Derek, what you were saying about foregrounding cultures. This is about foregrounding different cultures and different ways of doing this. And I'm not saying this lightly in terms of like different ways of leadership. So I would go further than Jenny, and I would go, the structures that we have and how they have been led have been for us a purpose, a certain way of mission, a charitable mission, a way that has been regulated and structured. And I think the greatest act of leadership for those who hold power, and all of us do at different points, we are in this room. This room is not open to everyone. So let's acknowledge that. The greatest thing that we can do in that sort of charting a path to a just transition or decolonial way is to ask how much power I'm willing to give away, and to ask yourself, am I being a Lord Curzon with a new social justice language? Because that is how previous transitions have happened. And if we are supporting that, let's not be surprised if where we end up looks different, but has similar power structures to where we are now.
Thank you, Ali. I wanted to come to a final question in this part of the discussion to Stephanie, because very much in your work, you are asking wealth holders to reimagine wealth and to give up power. In terms of how you approach that, how do you approach that, particularly when it's going to be against everything that they have been brought up to learn?
Thanks, Derek. Yes, I mean, so much of this is about acknowledging the culture that we've been socialized into around the excessive accumulation of wealth and this scarcity mindset, which really underpins much of the, the framing of our dominant economic model. And so we're inviting wealth holders into a space where they can begin to evaluate their wealth practices and look at to what extent they align with their values, the way they see the world, whether it aligns with what they believe about what it means to live in a fair society, and is it contributing to the world that they want to leave for future generations. So we're supporting them with a broad range of strategies around how they can use their wealth, their assets, in regenerative and reparative ways. But just as a primary example, which applies equally to philanthropic institutions, is a lot of these folks hold investments in financial markets, which are typically driving a carbon intensive economy. They're relying on continued extraction and oppression, and they're looking at how do they play their part in supporting the just transition from this dig, burn, dump economy to a more sustainable and regenerative and equitable model. And so, a key strategy in that is supporting people to, actually eliminate and, at least minimize, but in a lot of cases, eliminate their participation in the speculative economy. If this conversation, if you're stifled by this conversation, by the discomfort, I invite you to do just a purely mathematical exercise, and that's to look at who is benefiting from the wealth that you have, which is tied up in the speculative economy. Is it the communities that you purport to serve and benefit, or is it the financial institutions that surround the speculative investment universe, which serves to concentrate wealth and power across certain demographics and geographies, and really to have an honest conversation about that. So really we're supporting people to really move away from this narrative, this culture that we've been socialized into, which legitimizes the excessive accumulation of wealth, and helping them to think about, okay, how can I start divesting from this extractive universe and begin to use wealth to transform or to build new systems, essentially, and not to do that themselves, but to empower the communities they want to serve to build those systems themselves.
Thank you, Stephanie. Marai.
Thanks, Derek. I just wanted to quickly, the question that you'd asked at the beginning about if you like funds that are led by and for, I just want to speak to the importance of those funds. So if we are willing to accept that those being harmed and those closest to the harm are those that are best placed to design and deliver any kind of solution. So whether we're talking about at small scale community initiatives, or whether we're talking about kind of larger movement spaces, then surely one of the things that we can start to connect with is that funds that are led by and for us, if you like, are in deep community and deep relationship with, so in and of the communities that that we are seeking to resource. And so that's something that's really important, because we need to disrupt that benevolence. Like, it's always worth any funder to think, like, are you invested in holding the current system in place, or maybe reshuffling it a little bit? Or are you invested in, like, what does it look like? What does climate justice actually look like? What does social justice mean? How does it feel? And how do we get there? We can't get there if we keep doing the same things with a little bit of tweaking at the edges. And if the folk who are best placed and who are located in community aren't able to be supported to resource that work at the level of community, we're just we're literally moving the pieces around on the board. And that is not, if people want to talk about solution focused work, that's not solution focused work. What that is a power play. And so there's something about, like, being willing to give up power in the interest of the justice that we're saying we want for our planet, the justice that we're saying we want for our collective liberation. That's why buy-in for funds are important.
Thank you, Mara. I'm going to come very quickly into some questions, and there's been a ton of them, and I'm not going to get to every single one, but I will do my best. So I'm going to direct this to Jenny and Ali in the first instance. This is 3 questions, so hold fire on this one. So one of the questions, what is the internal makeup of your foundation? How many racialized people are in decision-making positions or on your board? Do you have internal policies and strategies on DEI and equity? And what do you mean by intellectualizing the problem? So if you guys could nail those in a couple of minutes, I would be forever grateful.
I can kick off. So internal makeup, no, we don't have anyone in, we're in the process of looking at our structures, but its current existence is still hierarchical. And in senior management, no, we don't have any person, global majority person in position. However, on our board, we have recently, I think in the past 18 months, had 3 people from racialized communities join the board, alongside others from what we in the UK call working class backgrounds. That's that answer. Do we have internal policies and strategies? Honest answer, I think so, but I don't know. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that one. And intellectualizing, well, how long have you got? What that means really is spending an awful lot of time unpicking what the layers of meaning of words might be and how it gets interpreted by different people. And can I say this word in 3 different ways? And what are the subtle nuances to that sentence? And we spend a lot of time saying things like how rather than when. So it's the head piece. It is the piece about how do I write this in a way that a policy think tank will understand, rather than breaking it down into this is what needs to happen. I hope that's made sense.
Thank you, Jenny. Sorry, I'm going to jump into the next question. I always think that intellectualizing is a way of people that don't understand something framing things in a way that keeps them in the frame, and marginalizing others. I wanted to come to this next question. What do you think is the most urgent institutional change that funders need to make in the short term? That's for everyone.
Find any way to be accountable. Any way. Like, go on a street and find 15 people to poll them is more accountability than what we have right now. Like, and also, like, the other test for me is like, ask your cleaner what she thinks or he thinks about what you are doing. There's a sort of a lot of people that are just moving around us, and we are in this space, intellectual space, and we talk in an intellectual space and we don't connect it to the real world. And the other side of it, I would say, because this is environmental justice, the accountability probably will not happen just in the country of origin. The accountability that should happen should be happening across borders and languages that we don't understand and we haven't invested time to understand.
Thank you, Ali. Does anyone else have a response to that question?
I've got a quick one. Make plans to spend down, but don't dump the risk on people. Actually be in deep conversation with community, so that what you do is you share some of that knowledge, that kind of some of the, I don't know, you know, some of the good stuff in terms of like how do you move money, all of those things. But yeah, a lot more people need to make plans to spend down. Like, get rid of the money. If you accept that it's not yours, why are you holding on to it for 50 years? Maybe actually go, you know, we're in a meta crisis. Like, tell yourself 8 years. Give yourself an 8-year time frame. That would be good.
Another question. What are some of the long-term deep changes that we shouldn't lose sight of? That's to all panelists.
I can go. I think where the extraction is moving and who controls that extraction. We are moving from carbon to other stuff. And that is important in terms of, you know, the communities and the challenges that we will have 150 years from now. The question has moved beyond just carbon, but we have to look at, you know, where those communities have autonomy and sovereignty, and as Stephanie was saying, control over their resources and assets.
I would add to it that this is everybody's issue. And, you know, don't lose sight of that. Don't become siloed. Don't resist that and become single issue or single agency responses. It can't be that. We have to do this together. And that means giving up some stuff.
Thank you, Jenny. Final one from me. How do we subvert the DEI fatigue and the race to skip back to normal?
Oh, whoever asked that, I love you. Thank you. First of all, let's get rid of like some of the language of DEI, because DEI is like now this thing where people want to rest comfortably and actually not make deep change. So people want people to come and do like a quick 2-hour diversity and equity or equality workshop. So some of that is actually, what is it that we are trying to have happen? What's the future that we're trying to create, and how can we work backwards from that? Like, what's the deep work? If you're going to do emancipation work or liberation work or social justice work, it is not a 2-hour workshop. What it is, a 2-hour workshop is an invitation into a space. A conversation like this, as beautiful as it is a deepening of practice and an invitation into the space. You need to know, as long as we're on the planet, we are on the work of repair, which means that we have to do deep intentional work, and we also have to be loving and generous and rigorous with each other and fierce and accountable and be like no nonsense, and always go, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Like, what's your legacy? Like, each of us, is your legacy a DEI moment, or is your legacy like, this is transformative? Like, actually, no nonsense, I'm in this for the long haul. Oh, and rest. We have to rest. But that's not for the power holders. Power holders, not as much rest. Like us tired folk, we need some rest. Some of the power holders do more work to get us to rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get through all of the questions, but I know we're coming to a close. But before we come to a close, it's normally customary for me to do a kind of roundup of things. I don't want to do that. I really want to leave the final word here to everyone. So just as a final word, or a key takeaway, or a thing that you want those in attendance to really hear. I'll come to you, Stephanie, first. What's the 2 or 3 things that you want people to really hear?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, I guess, going back to what I was saying earlier about being in breach of this, you know, we have this vision for a world of justice, and where we have repair and regenerative model of living as a global community. But many individuals who would agree with that vision, institutions that would agree with that vision, are in breach. And so the invitation is to go back and take that vision to your table and to see how you are in breach, not if, and to look at how much your endowment, the funds that are entrusted to you are benefiting systems of oppression, whether that's, the wealth manager that's managing your funds, whether it's, look at all how the capital is allocated, and is it benefiting one particular community over another. By community, I'm talking about Wall Street, I'm talking about the city, I'm talking about the different communities of extraction that exist, and the communities that you wish to serve and to benefit. And I guess finally, how can you divest yourself of power? How can you continually reflect on and look at where power is situated in your organizations, in your networks and influence? And how can you continually divest yourself of that power in favor of the communities that have been extracted from and harmed?
Thank you, Stephanie. Jenny.
I'll be brief, because Stephanie said quite a lot of what I'd want to say, but I think it would be about feeling that injustice, what I started with, feeling that in your belly, you know it, we feel it, and we ignore it. Don't ignore it. If you ignore it, then it keeps us where we are. And don't be afraid. All of us have some power. And if we say we can't do something, that's buying into the narrative. We're letting stuff go. Own your power. Step into it, and something will happen, and something good will happen. Because we don't have a choice. We have 8 years. If we're putting a time frame, now's the time.
Thank you, Jenny. Now's the time. Ali.
I would make 3 comments that sort of make them link to what Stephanie and Jenny were saying. Do not lose sight of your power and agency. You have more than the average person who is listening and reading about this, and make that count. Part 2, do not center yourself. Oh, philanthropy. Yes, we have a role, but social transformation has not come from philanthropy. Likely, we can at best support it. And 3, if you have a power over grants, over investments, over Lord Curzon's with better language of this world, use it. Use it now, because we need to move direction.
Thank you, Ali. Marahai.
Thank you, and thanks for this space. If you are a funder of the type that holds a lot of power, that is well resourced, stop using risk as an excuse to not resource the folk that need to be resourced. The folk that are actually holding the risk every day in our bodies, either on the front line, like in terms of ecological collapse, or a front line in terms of racial injustice, or both, or like disability. Like, just stop using risk as an excuse. Like, absorb that into your body and into your organizations, and actually use the power that you have to challenge and disrupt, instead of constantly expecting us to hold the disruption, the risk, the challenge, and all of that stuff. That's one. The second thing, Che Guevara said, a true revolutionary is motivated by feelings of great love. And I want to invite us all to imagine, if we loved the planet, if we loved all of humanity the way that we might love the people that we deem to be precious to us, how would we behave? If philanthropy really came from a place of deep, deep revolutionary love, which isn't fluffy, it really is about change and transformation. If we did that, how would we show up? And I'm going to ask us to show up from a place of like deep revolutionary love and accountability to ancestors, the benevolent, loving ancestors, and to 7 generations into the future at least. show up for that, if nothing else.
I thank you. And I think that is an ideal way to end. Thank you, panelists, for an amazing last hour and a half. So much knowledge crammed into such a short period of time. We'll keep the conversation going after this particular point. But just to close today, I want to bring back in Farhana Yamin and Heather McGray to finish today's session.
Well, I'm incredibly moved. Maybe you didn't see, but many of you, I was very tearful at times. It's been an incredible honor. There are so few spaces where we can say these things, where we can learn from each other, where we can hold each other, we're identifying needs for those of us who work in philanthropy to move forward, and things are making progress. My dog is now barking like mad, so I'm going to say thank you and ask Heather, who is my funder and who chose to allow me and trusted me to create this learning journey, to end and say a little bit, in the last minute or two. Excuse me, my dog is barking at the door. Gone out now. So Heather is the ED of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and they are undergoing a transformative process in response to many of the things that have been discussed today. So over to you, Heather, to have the final say, but we will be following up with more such webinars. Please spread the word. I think the next one will probably be on re-granters and others who are working especially to support movements, local and grassroots NGOs, and on just transition. But more on that, and over to you, Heather. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much,
Derek,
Farhana.
Panelist, obviously. Thank you.
Yes. And as Farhana mentioned, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund is in the process right now of reconfiguring our governance. So we will no longer be a funder-driven pooled fund, and will become a fund governed by activists and practitioners. And we are mid-process. You can read about it a little on our newsletter on our website if you're curious. But this webinar comes at a wonderful moment for that process. And it comes at an important moment for me here too. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., where you may have heard in the news this week and last have brought a new round of grieving for some very deeply unjust systemic failures. And so it personally has been so heartening to me to hear this panel. And thank you, Farhana, for your tears and the spirit of everything that's been said here today. It really has touched me very deeply and brought some really important and profound opportunities to really have our thinking provoked. And so, on behalf of the core funders involved in the Climate Justice Just Transition Donors Initiative, thank you all. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Farhana, and your team behind you, and all of the panelists who brought so much wisdom to us today.
Oh, thank you so much. And we finished absolutely on time. What a brilliantly run panel. And to still have 120 people. And for most of that hour and a half, we had the highest number that we've ever had. So thank you hugely for all of the brilliant work that you're doing. And I've learned lots, and a big and enormous hug to you all. And yeah, we'll carry on, and we'll take forward the suggestions also that some people made for, maybe having spaces where we can hold each other and can work together. For those of us like me who's work in philanthropy, it's been a long and tough and lonely journey at times, and it's getting easier, and that's joyous. So thank you very much. Thank you, Derek, hugely. Thank you,